Hi, I'm Marla Fleischman Owen, Director of the Fort Worth Community Arts Center, and I'm excited today to be speaking with Katherine Akey. Katherine is our artist that's in our Hayes Foundation Gallery at the Arts Center. Katherine, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Marla, first, thank you for having me on for this artist talk. I love an opportunity to talk about my work a little bit more. And it's been such a pleasure working with the Community Arts Center over the last almost 2 years now. The show got delayed by COVID. It's been like a really long process, and I appreciate all of the patience from you guys on your end as we got this rescheduled. Um, so I'm originally from Virginia. I went to NYU and studied neuroscience, and then sort of did a big pivot and went to the International Center of Photography for an MFA in photography. Yeah, which was like a really, really big change for me. I sort of had gone into college thinking a lot about creativity and language and the mind, and decided a PhD was not the right fit for me. And what I wanted to do was explore those aspects of human experience, but not in a scientific lab, through other means. Um, I'd been in New York for about 10 years before relocating to DC, which was actually where I was when I first applied for this show and got accepted for an exhibition at the Arts Center. While I was there, I was teaching at university. I was teaching at the Corcoran, which is now part of GW. I was working for the World War I Centennial Commission, the National Commission to commemorate World War I. And I was running a community darkroom in the city of DC. Last fall, I relocated here to San Francisco with my family. I've got a little girl who just turned 2, and my husband. So it's been a really chaotic couple of years for us. Lots of moves, starting a family, COVID delaying projects, and all of that. But that is where we're at now.
Wow, that is a fascinating background in just that short little time that you told us about. It also helps explain some of the history that's in the pieces that you're showing. So, one of my questions is why have you chosen these particular time periods to work from?
Yeah, World War One is not always the very first part of history that Americans think of. It gets very overshadowed in our cultural and collective memories by World War II, which in itself is a whole topic of interest for me. But my interest in it started when I was very young. My father, who's an archaeologist based out of Greece, he has traveled to Gallipoli a number of times, and he always found the landscape at Gallipoli very impactful on him. And his sort of interest in the war bled over into me. And when I was younger, he would sort of sneak World War I books to me, even though my mother thought they were very morbid. And it just sort of fed this interest. And of course, I was really into air shows, and growing up in Virginia, and sort of the military history just is everywhere there. We literally grew up on the side of a Civil War battlefield in rural Virginia. So that kind of history sort of filtered down from my parents, filtered down from my dad. And it was in college that I just started reading tons about World War I and sort of became a little bit of a historian on my own. And then when we moved to DC, the centennial of the war was happening. It was 2016 when we moved, and I didn't have a job lined up. I thought, hey, it'd be great to volunteer. And I started volunteering for the World War I Centennial Commission. And then they hired me, and I ended up working for them throughout the centennial. I wrote and produced a weekly 1-hour podcast for them where we followed the events of the war throughout the centennial, looking back 100 years. It was incredibly rewarding and fulfilling. I ended up doing a historical research fellowship through the Carnegie Council for Ethics on World War I era photographs. So I've sort of spent a lot of time feeding the research nerd history side of this passion. And all during this time was thinking, how do I bring this into my art practice? What do I want to make work about? Why is this so interesting to me? And ultimately, it comes down to just, it's nice to make work about something you're really excited about. but also conflict is such a good place to look for human experience and try to understand human experience better, because it's all extremes, right? It's extremes of violence and fear, but it's also extremes of boredom and uncertainty and quietude. And I find a lot of times when you look at the first person materials from this war, they have a joke in the army that army life is hurry up and wait. There's a lot of time where nothing is happening, and the men are having gardening competitions and playing cards and finding ways to make life bearable under unbearable circumstances. There's just, it might be controversial to say or hard to understand without looking at the material yourself, but there's a lot of beauty in those moments and in that experience. So I just find it endlessly rewarding to keep going back to this era and the experiences of people who lived through it.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I do understand the contradiction of fear and, being at war and all of that, and then also trying to make your space livable and the camaraderie and friendships that are developed during that. For Darkness Shall Cover Me, what made you choose fabric to tell these stories?
Yeah, I'm trained as a photographer, and there's very little actual photography in this show. It's one of the first big projects I've done. There's a cyanotype, which is a photograph. It's a photographic process, but it wasn't made with negatives. It was made with stencils, so it's more akin to a photogram than a photograph. My initial intent was to work on a lot more paper, but the pieces didn't want to be that, and the circumstances didn't lend themselves to me working on paper. So for the quilted pieces that I call the Sugar Blue series, they were
I can show
inspired.
some of those if you like.
Yeah, please. They were inspired by a story from a RFC, a Royal Flying Corps captain. That's what the British Air Force had been before it was named the Air Force, where the men were having so much trouble navigating bombing raids at night, because this is pre-electrified Europe. So it's totally dark. And the maps they had to memorize their routes were very hard for them to sort of translate into the nighttime landscape. So he took what was called sugar paper, which is a kind of paper that was used at the time to transport and package sugar. We don't use it anymore. It was dyed black, blue black, purple black with a dye called logwood, which I used to dye the pieces. And he made these sort of, I call them like dark mode maps with charcoal on that paper, much like we flip our Google Maps at night when it's dark and it's blinding us. And he basically made maps that were more akin to the night landscape for his men. And then they did a lot better navigating during their bombing raids. So my intent was like dye paper, work with paper, do printmaking. That's something in my wheelhouse. And as I was working with it, it was just, the dye wasn't light fast enough on the paper, and I was getting really frustrated with the sort of staticness and the flatness of printmaking. And I had this moment where I sort of realized, why don't I go back to this story for another material? Very early planes, and flying was only invented a few years before World War I kicked off. A lot of the planes in the first year or two of the war were actually made out of linen stretched over wood. And so I found some of the Irish linen. It's the same kind of linen stock that had been used on planes. And I ordered a ton of that from Ireland. And I dyed it. I worked with dye, and I started to see that that was where it wanted to go. That was a material that I could bring back. There's a lot of history as well of women quilting and auctioning quilts to raise money during the war. There's a long legacy of soldiers being taught embroidery in convalescence to rehabilitate them. So it's sort of all started to piece together for me once I let go of it being paper and I let the story inform me a little bit more.
Well, that is really fascinating, and I appreciate the extra effort you went to get the right linen and have that shipped to you and
Yeah.
those specific dyes.
The whole process of what linen do I get? I knew it was linen. I had to find what I ended up doing. I had a lot of trouble getting the exact type of linen from a historian. I found a newspaper article from DC from like 1919, 1920, where they were auctioning off huge lots of extra stuff left over from the war, because the war ended way faster than people thought it would. And so they were auctioning off for cheap all this extra crap from the army. And one of the lots was linen for planes. And it had in the description details of the kind of linen. And so I found that in a newspaper archive. And then I contacted the linen supplier. I was like, do you guys still make this? So it was a whole, like, basically a PhD thesis in and of itself, just trying to figure out what kind of fabric was it actually.
Well, it's what it sounds like. I mean, that was a lot of initiative and a lot of trouble to get all of that together. So, well, the pieces are beautiful. We love having them in our space. So my next question, you've kind of answered about how the materials how it tells the story that you're telling, and you've talked about that. Is there anything else that you would like to? Actually, I'm really interested in the blue. What did you call cyanotype?
Cyanotype, yeah.
Cyanotype. Like what is the process for that?
Yeah,
can see that.
cyanotype's a wonderful, wonderful photographic process. It's sometimes called sun printing. It's also the process that's used for blueprints, the original way of producing blueprints. So it's a photographic process. It's a chemical emulsion that you can apply to any organic material, fabrics or papers, or I have a friend from graduate school who's based in Denmark, and she prints on travertine stone and marble and bone and shells and all kinds of things. And it's very good to work with at home or with kids, because all you need is sunlight and water. It gets exposed to UV, and you can do that with a UV box or just with your light coming in from outside. And then to process it, you don't need chemistry, you just rinse it in water. And that develops, stops, and fixes the photographic process. So it's this very sort of streamlined, simple process. The actual chemistry has some interesting history. It produces Prussian blue, so it's tied in to sort of the cultural and industrial legacy of Germany and Prussia. It also has some very strange chemistry ties to Nazi Germany. So it has like this really interesting legacy when it comes to the chemistry itself. But of course, I sort of picked it for this piece because I initially was going to print this on paper, on long strips of watercolor paper, and have the planes be very crisp, almost like a butterfly collection or something, where you could see all these little details between these plane types. Plane technology and technology in general during the war went so fast. You start the war with linen planes and you end with basically jet planes from World War II. You start the war on cavalry and you end with tanks coordinated with infantry. It's very fast. So you get all of these sort of evolutionary variations in technology very quickly. So there's just a million types of plane designs that sort of get abandoned and tried. So I really wanted it to look like that, to be this very static, stiff blueprint kind of butterfly display. I had access to a big enough dark room when I was teaching at GW to do that, because paper is a little less forgiving to work on. But then COVID happened and I lost access to the space, and I just didn't have room to do that in my apartment in DC. So I thought about working with silk. Silk is another material that I sort of pulled from history. Often you will see pilots wearing silk scarves wrapped around their faces or around their necks. This is because of the oil that was used on the propellers at the time. It sort of aerosolized as it spun while they flew, and they're not enclosed in cockpits. And if they breathed too much of it, it would give them the runs. It would make them really sick. So they wore these scarves to keep them from breathing in too much of this was oil. Otherwise they would just be really, really sick all the time. So silk felt like a good place to go. And then when I started producing them, I got all these crinkles and there was so much more movement in it. And I just thought, well, that's so much more what it wanted to be than this stiff, flat, dark, dark, dark sort of blueprint effect. But it's a wonderful, wonderful process. Very easy to do. You can buy kits on Amazon for $20 with solution A and solution B. You mix them in equal parts and then you're off to the races. I mean, I did these on my porch and then rinsed them in my bathtub. And they're 15 feet long, so they're not nothing. But it's like, if you just are willing to mess up a few times, this is a really easy process. It's super accessible. You can even buy pre-treated sheets of paper to do with kids, and you just put your leaves or your baby doll or your seashells on it and then rinse it in the kitchen sink and make beautiful little photographs.
Yeah, that's awesome. I remember doing it with leaves when my kids were young. So why did you decide on the scale for this piece? Because it's so large in the space, and some of the other ones are much more, diminutive by comparison.
Yeah. Well, on one hand, the size kind of got away from me as I started making it. I think that happens sometimes. You're like, great, I'm going to work. Ooh, and then you actually see it and you're like, oh, it's huge. So it got big while I was making it. I tried doing one panel and sticking all the planes on it, and it just felt very crowded. And when I realized I was going this direction on the silk with this a little bit more space and a little bit more movement and a little bit more breeziness, I stopped wanting them to all be very close and very static, like that butterfly display I sort of had been thinking about initially. So I just let it take up a little space and expand. I was also thinking a lot about Chris Burden's piece, All the Submarines in the United States of America, I think is maybe what it's called, where he made little wooden models of every submarine the US has ever produced and hung them in this cloud in the middle of the gallery space. I had seen that years ago, and my grandfather served in the Navy on diesel submarines his whole life. He was in the Navy for like 40 years or something. And it had such an impact on me, this like cloud of them, and thinking about his whole life spent on which submarine in that cloud I didn't know. And I liked the presence of it in a room. And so I tried to keep that in mind while I was making this and thinking about it having a presence. It's also supposed to be evocative visually and aesthetically of the sky. So why not just go big?
Well, it's beautiful, and I love the layering and the way the light filters through each layer of it. It's a
Yeah.
beautiful piece. We love it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very happy that I sort of let my circumstances dictate how it went, because the original idea was this one long strip of paper across a wall, and I feel like it's much more dynamic and much more engaging the way that it is now, just sort of embracing the material that I could work with. I think this is something we all struggle with. It's like, do I have access to space? Do I not? Especially in disciplines like photography or printmaking, you're so reliant on equipment that you sometimes get boxed in and you have to just put a project off. I was also pregnant when I started making a lot of these works. And so I had to sort of, when I was teaching and in my own practice, make decisions about what I was and wasn't going to be able to do. I was able to dye all the fabrics because logwood's a natural dye. And I was able to work with, soda ash and wood chips and things like that. And it was safe, and the cyanotype I could work with, but it did also kind of limit what I was making and how I was making it, that I was pregnant and then breastfeeding a newborn the whole time I was making all of this work, which I think will be really interesting to look back on in 10 years, that I had all of this darkroom practice with really harsh chemistry. And then for a few years, all of that disappeared. And I imagine it'll start to come back in when all the young family parts of my life sort of taper off.
Well, I hope so. I'll be excited to see what you come up with when you're using those materials. So, well, Katherine, I really appreciate your time today speaking with us. And just a reminder, Katherine's exhibit is up through October 30th at the Arts Center in our Spencer and Margaret Hayes Foundation Gallery. Hope you will come by and see us. And again, thank you so much, Katherine. I really appreciate you telling us about this. It's so interesting, so much more than what you would get just from looking at the pieces. So really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it so much. I really love the opportunity to speak more. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, well, hopefully we will see you in Texas at some point.
I hope so too.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.